Hello, hello. Unable to chat. Why is it saying that? Okay, I'm going to give this about 30 seconds and then start in a second. All right, folks. Let me see here. Okay, still waiting for some people to join the chat at least. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start. And as always, I will just post this on. Okay, so last time when we were talking, we kind of discussed Iran moving out of the Iran-Iraq War, which, as you saw, kind of really reconstructed the Iranian society and its relationship with its relationship with the world, right? And that's also kind of politically defined Iran. One was kind of this idea of living with war economy, and the other is just how are we going to reconstruct this nation, after years of having arbitrary rule and dynastic rule, right? And when Khomeini came to power, you kind of saw this where we were, even though the institutions were being set and laws were being written and society was kind of being constructed, but then there were also kind of powers that were distributed based on who won each struggle, right? Like for example, Khomeini stayed on until the end of his life as the supreme leader, and he definitely had a vision of who should be ruling, right? And how to kind of curb this democratic processes of Iran at the time. So then we saw the emergence of Khamenei, and then we kind of have to talk about Rafsanjani. And we're still working on the same slides here. So as I said, Akbar Hashim Rafsanjani is from Bahraman. He lived from 1934 till 2017 is the when he died. And he was the fourth president of Iran, right? And that was from 89 till 97, which is two terms of 4 years, right? And he had other roles as the head of the Guardian Councils. He was much revolutionary himself. He was very involved with the war, but and he comes from kind of a lucrative background of pistachio farmers, and he. For many reasons, part of his competencies and background, he was always kind of involved with the financial processes of the Iranian government. So what are some of Rafsanjani's struggles at this time. This is one is kind of reconstructing an economic system that is not a war economy, right? You're not just producing what is needed for the war through the processes of war, right? Through the way you're kind of oriented toward the world in the war. At this time, Iran was a very isolated state that we've kind of talked about. There is this rapidly declining standard of life, especially comparing to the days of Pahlavi. Some of are declining politically and economically, and some are stagnated, right? I kind of try to talk about this in previous lectures, this idea of when you do have access to when you enter a certain class or you emerge as a new generation, you have certain expectations of your government and society, right, to cater to you and to give you kind of the life opportunities that are fit to your kind of expectations. But at the same time, there's a certain brain drain, right? There are people who are might have been supporters of revolution, but after seeing kind of what the revolution brought, they left the country. And then there was a war, which always leads to kind of people that can moving out, right? So then there's this new, there's a segment of population that is emerging, moving to the city still, and then they are not of people who have either the possibility of leaving or kind of sending their kids to study abroad, or having kind of extending their families abroad to have kind of more of a free flow, right? The privileges that come from middle classes or upcoming kind of petty bourgeois classes that have built wealth and certain possibilities for themselves, right? I mean, think of, for example, a person in the United States, a person that just comes from a family that are not college educated, like they're the first college educated student in their family, and they come from a poor background, rather than a person that have a family that is college educated and can pay their kids while they're in college, so they don't have to work, like had them having access to a car, you know what I mean? So there are even people in a kind of a same place in a society. It can't be that is only an appearance, right? You always need this background wealth. So this is kind of giving birth to these new segments in society, right? So they align themselves politically differently. Oil prices are down at this time in the beginning of the year, as of Rafsanjani, with $20 a barrel. Very interesting to our own current predicament. A couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, there was last year projection was that oil prices today were going to be around $60-70 a barrel, right? It turns out with the coronavirus, it came out as $30, right? So half of the projection. A couple of weeks ago, it was 20. Or about a week ago, it was like $18, and now it is in negatives, right? Which is something that has never happened. But the oil prices are, especially for mono economy countries or states in the United States, like Alaska, Texas, and Louisiana, places like that. It is just connected to many other forms of industries, and how we kind of we measure our economic strength, right? Because it's connected to so many other aspects of international society. And when the oil gets so cheap, we saw, I think I talked about last time, or maybe I'll talk about it later on today, about, since Iran even tried to continue producing and selling oil at this time after the war, selling something like $8 a barrel, right? It's how in a couple of weeks ago there was this OPEC kind of understanding there's this of course uh, s- oil wars going on between China and Russia right now, but at the end of the day, sometimes you can bring these countries together to, excuse me, make a certain kind of agreement regarding how much oil prices should be and who can sell how much, right? So the countries that are outside of this sometimes like go on and engage with the market on their own, right? So Iran did this at this time with $8 a barrel, and that does not bring money because sometimes the cost of production cannot is too high, right? To sell something for $8. But also when the oil is this low, it also means the demand for it sometimes is very low for um, basically numerous reasons. Sometimes consumers are not buying, nevertheless, so the oil prices, especially for these countries like Venezuela, Iran, are very important, right? They're really important for a lot of countries. I mean, especially even for the United States now, after President Obama kind of reconstructed and kind of put U.S. as a oil market on the map, right? That this ideas of drilling and all that, which is kind of funny because there was uh, the drill baby drill is seen for people not familiar with politics inside the United States as like a conservative thing. But the people who are actually developed it, for good or bad, agree or disagree, were under Obama's administration, right? And the drilling of Anwar and all those stuff. Anyway, so keep in mind, I mentioned oil prices; they're important. Um, um, so so, and I kind of briefly put emphasis on this idea of that the as the war is ending and we're going to the 90s, especially by the mid 90s, you're talking about a new generation, the generation before mine, who are, they don't have a living memory of a revolution. They're kind of, their historical imagination, if you will, is connected to who they're around, and connected to the kind of the histories that the world produces in each states. So they're not that connected to it, right? And they're not maybe so worried about it. I mean, like people are, but nevertheless, you want a good living condition within coming forth, right? A lot of these people were also too young to have fought in the war, right? So this is yeah, there are new expectations from Iranian government, and this wartime legitimization of hardline, patriotic right wing politics are also not so appealing anymore. So Rafsanjani also comes across as a kind of a pragmatic, I don't want to say reformist, because the idea was to kind of ease up this idea of a revolutionary government that is especially judicially very right wing, but not too much. But I guess the way he had campaigned was in the way that we're going, some kind of vague the semblance of promises of change, right? Um, so this is how kind of Rafsanjani responds, and you can go to the next PowerPoint. Firstly has to start building a coalition to kind of resist the hardline elements within the Iranian government and this kind of revolutionary government, which is always connected to the hardline of the Iranian government. He wants to have a political and economic liberalism, and I'm using that in a sense of how liberalism liberalism used in the world outside the United States in a way of, even though the politics match, this idea of like um, moving away from central planning and too much interference within individuals' lives, right? But that also means lesser attention to welfare. So this idea of that you're going to open the processes of a country to the world markets, right? So um, take, for example, this idea of like right now about producing kind of medical equipment, right? What the United States doing is like our government is very resistant on for example, even though President Trump did kind of do the presidential act regarding production, but he was very resistant, in a way of telling like what certain companies should make certain what kind of products for whom at what price, right? This idea is like we're just going to let the markets take care of these things, right? Like so that is kind of the difference, right? So if there are certain problems within the nation at the time, you just let the natural processes of markets fix them up, right? What should we do with the oil prices? Well, we'll partake within the world within kind of the more world dialogue about the sale of oil, but we also let other markets take care of this. Or on the subject of infrastructure, do we kind of engage and spend Iran's kind of own money of building all these different infrastructures? The answer is yes to that, of course, but you also invite foreign entities to come and build the infrastructure within your nation, which did happen at this time and will continue to happen. So that's why I put it. So yeah, so this is kind of when this idea of liberalism or neoliberalism kind of enters Iran form, and it's trying to take the place of central planning and nationalistic economics, right? This idea that we're going to pay attention to, we're going to reformulate every economic question about how it affects us, right? And look, there are debates about can you formulate, these kind of questions like that in an expanding international world. But nevertheless, this was kind of the kind of trajectory that Rafsanjani was choosing for Iran at this time. So although kind of Rafsanjani succeeds in the infrastructural projects of it, building dams, roads, housing is a big deal. The urban population in Iran is going up at a very kind of high rate. He could not politically kind of part. He couldn't influence the right in Iran to a point of easing some of these restrictions, right? And this goes, this is kind of about what, for example, how to mitigate between the rights of women in compared to men, to what laws are appropriate, what not, what kind of censorship we're going to have, what kind of what is the parameter for what newspapers can say, right? Like this kind of political questions. But so he wasn't that successful, and from the perspective of a lot of people, Iran was kind of stagnating at this point. And this is why, and you can go to the next slide, that by 1997, in the 90s, after kind of an era of a more peaceful Iran, and this is, of course, not just because of Rafsanjani being a competent president. You had Bill Clinton coming up in United States, and Tony Blair, in this what we call the new left, right? With for example, Tony Blair in England calls his party the New Labour Party rather than Labour Party, right? This idea that, okay, the left has suffered a lot of political projects to the right, especially the Thatcherite and Reagan type of rights that are, some consider to be extremely on the right. So they don't want to be totally on the left, so they have conservative elements, but they also have this new kind of project for the left, right? For example, Bill Clinton is it's not that he's kinder and gentler with the relationship of the United States to the outside world, right? Especially after Bush has come and had the first Gulf War, which was kind of a confusing war for everyone. And Bush was saying that George H.W. Bush, this idea that the saying is we need to kind of bury the kind of the psychological hurt that American people suffered because of the loss in Vietnam in the sands of the Middle East, right? This idea that we're going to kind of make our presence known there and some in Central America, especially Panama and places like that. So when Clinton comes in, it's not like he has a gentler way of taking care of responding to the Middle East and some countries in Africa and Afghanistan, but he does not challenge Iran, like at least too politically within the public eyes, right? Which kind of gives Iran this a sense of kind of easing up and also being a little more responsive to the world. But and not a but, and on the other hand, Clinton was kind of who he had a problem with at this time was Iraq, right? Not Iran. So the focus is shifting to Saddam Hussein, which is kind of to since George H.W. Bush comes to be seen as the real problem in the Middle East rather than this revolutionary Iran. But then there is also events of Bosnia and Serbs, right? The ethnic cleansing that the Christians are inflicting on Muslims, that even though Iran is also involved within that problem through proxies in defending Muslims as they see it, and the United States is involved, they're on the same side, right? Because the nationalist Christian Serbs they don't get to win the public's goodwill, especially because of their fascistic tendencies, right? That kind of don't translate within American politics and history as something that to be embraced, right? Like, oh, we're Christian, they're Christian, then we're on their side. That's not how it goes. United States and a lot of countries come on the side of the Muslims that are being kind of slaughtered. It's a very complicated and interesting conflict that happens in the 90s. It's worth looking into if you're interested, especially the Iran's relation to that event, because it gives you kind of more explanation power. But I can get kind of I've already talked too much about it. It's gonna get us off the course, right? But just kind of wanted to make this point that Bill Clinton at this time is way more focused on Iraq in the Middle East as to finding an adversary than Iran. So this easing up by 97 leads to the fifth, what did I say? Sorry, it says fourth here. Muhammad Khatami is the fifth president. I have to fix that. Khatami is born in 43. Right. Again, you're seeing kind of a change in generation, right? If you remember, like people like Khomeini are born, and Montazeri and Khalkhali, they're born in early in the 20th century. Now you're coming, a new generation of leaders are coming like Khatami, who are born, in the 40s, right? Who are adults when the revolution happened, but they're still. Is from Yaz. He's from Ardakan, and he is the president from 97 till 2005. So again, he gets to serve twice, and Khatami really does come in as a reformer, and as a reformer to the left of Rafsanjani, if you will, if you want to use those not so. Um, it's weird because you can use the right in Iran, but left doesn't make so much sense because the right is so far on the right that the left is kind of being like centrist or pragmatic. But nevertheless, he is to the left of Rafsanjani, and what do I mean by that is that he was very adamant on. Yes, there we are. Economically, we're slowly but surely entering this world that we were kind of antagonistic to and was antagonistic against us in the 80s. But political emancipation and expanding people's rights is definitely becomes Khatami's most important promise, right? I mean, and this is where I kind of begin to have actual memories from, because I was 85. So by this time, I'm like 12 years old, but there was a lot of enthusiasm, right? Kind of very Obama-like, this idea of like, oh, there is this person that is coming out that is going to really change Iran. Like, because some people are getting very tired of this perpetual kind of constricting revolutionary atmosphere. So what are some of these reforms? Let's go to the next slide. And I put a question on this era reform. I'll tell you why. I'll make it more clear in a bit. But let's touch on it a bit. So there is an ease of censorship, and you got to realize, I got to always say this, like, I do talk about the presidents and kind of how they approach the society, but I want you to take the world take my word as a president and his coalition within the government and parliament, right? Because the presidency in Iran, as you've seen, is not that powerful, right? There is this kind of very conservative coalition of institutions that are connected to the supreme leader. Then there's a parliament and the president, but the conservative also has a lot of influence in the parliament, right? So it's a very hard job to kind of maneuver these things while at the same time trying to appeal to the larger society. So there is this ease of censorship. This is in relation to music, in relation to books and magazines, and some activities, right? Like the relationship between men and women, especially in public. Because you're talking about when the revolution happened, and there was this kind of deliberate cultural change. You had something like, people going on TV and saying that, oh, clapping hands in public is not allowed, or dancing is against Islam. Like all religions and all interpreters of religion, these are just, creative interpretations, if you will, of what is and is not in Islam, right? But nevertheless, they're implemented. So what Khatami is doing is trying to, with his support in the government, trying to pull some of this back. And as I said, the post boomer era that are you've seen during Rafsanjani are now uh, be, even becoming more of adults, right? And they are also asking for a new Iran, but they are younger than Khatami, right? So keep that in mind, and certainly younger than Rafsanjani. But yeah, so these people are still have a very strong say within Iran, because also Iran has continued to have a very young population. Um, but this, so yeah, so these kind of political easing of Iran leads to this kind of reactionary conservatism that is again becoming invigorated, right? But now this time you can't just talk about a revolution or the evil people outside the country, the English or the Americans. So now there's this idea that um, we still that these reforms are like liberals, right? They are of they're against our kind of revolutionary project within this Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's a sort of a conservative, reactionary conservatism that is developing, and reactionary because they're defining themselves again these new kind of reforms, right? Um, Again, this idea of whose country is it is a big question in this. Um, I've already talked to you about which part the separation between the conservative and democratic institution. Yeah, so then there is this how do I want to put this idea of like what is Islam, right, and who is beginning to interpret it. And this is not this idea of, oh, there's this young reformist and they're debating this with the older generation, right? These are people, some of them that were in the revolution, that were in Khomeini's circle. So these are people that went to the war for Iran. So even within those factions, right? And this is why I kind of want to, you kind of have to separate conservative from fundamentalist. And not to, fundamentalists don't take connotations of like too negative connotation. I'm just kind of making political delineations here. That kind of lost my thought here for a second. Um, yeah, so within those people, people are coming like Soroush, and I mean, there's so many names to call that are like, well, is this what we have like an Islamic Republic? What are his justifications? Like, who and who's to say, right? Again, who's to say? Is it people from the home? Are the people in government? Is it the guardian council? Is the average democratic participant within Iran who's a Muslim? Is that a person that creates the Islamic Republic? Really, these questions are up for grab, and they're coming up. People writing books on it. People writing articles. As especially the more kind of reformists give these people kind of more leeway, the more people are kind of engaging in these conversations, and now in public. Um, and yeah, and then on this side, the executive branch and the judicial branch, and the judiciary, as I said, it becomes like a tool of control for this extra executive branch, which is connected to the supreme leader, to always trying to curtail this stuff, right, politically and culturally. So that is a tension that is going to keep on. I mean, it does still today. Um, at this time, this Khatami tries to do this twin bill thing where he's trying to empower the Majlis and the parliament, but it never passes, right? So Khatami on one end, he's trying to cater to the people, but for the future generations, right? Um he knows that he needs to empower the parliament and the president, the office of the presidency, in order to be able to kind of resist these other branches and institutions of government. But he's not, again, very successful in that. And this is something you saw, not exactly like this, but Rafsanjani tried to do, which becomes a problem. But nevertheless, Khatami has a lot of support in Iran. I mean, he's popular. He is very popular among a lot of folks, and early on in his presidency, there is a lot of hope that he can get things done. But as he finished, but so you can go to the next, and this is why, because here's kind of what happened. Like, internationally at this time, there's this kind of the left, or whatever that is not conservative, has redefined itself, and it wants to re-enter back into politics. Right? They have licked their wounds from their uh, uh, defeats in the 80s, right? Be it through military proxies of the United States, or being due to their own incompetency. But nevertheless, they've learned their lesson. They've dipped their toes in water in the 90s, and going into 2000, they want to come out. And what happens with 9/11 just really derails everything and redefines um, this flow of political, and what we had saw, right? In the 90s, you guys are too young to remember, but and I'm too young to remember, but I'm kind of a little closer to it. Um, there were people that were, writing stuff like the end of history, right? And not that the world is over, but this idea that um that uh that 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 the tensions between political ideologies was over, right? That capitalism, the kind of Reaganite, Thatcherite, neoliberal, or neoconservative, if you want to put it. Neoliberal is better. Kind of, let's expand. Neoliberal politics has won over all other ideologies, and from now on, there is just and the cultural wars are pretty much over and minuscule, and basically the project from now on is to globalize and liberalize the world, right? Like, that's what we do. And um and you might laugh, to this is kind of like how cocksure can you be to make these statements, um but for example, with you're talking about things like the internet's catching on. The everyday person around the world has access to them. In the United States, I mean, the economy is, for large segment of people, even though they're losing their labor rights, they're becoming affluent and see a lot of access to the world around them. But nevertheless, with the way things are going, what gives? Um, so kind of this is what uh, not only redefines any answer to conservatism, or even more leftward move. So I kind of covered a couple of those points already, but when 9/11 happened, and the United States kind of is trying to first go to Afghanistan in 2001, and then by 2003, there's a decision to go into Iraq, and we're going to leave all those kind of points aside. But I've talked about this, right? With that this idea of Taliban and some of these terrorist organizations are reminiscence of 80s proxy struggles between US and USSR, right? To train these kind of Muslims to and develop their ideology, so there'll be proxies of United States against the communism and all that. But nevertheless, after those the wall comes down and kind of Gorbachev is not really interested in these sort of conflicts with the West, these people are abandoned, except these people are people and they're living and then they have their own goals, right? And now they have new enemies. So nevertheless, the Taliban are in Afghanistan. They're Sunni, first of all, and second of all, they have kind of Saudi backgrounds, right? A lot of these people are from Saudi Arabia. And couple from other countries, but nevertheless, not only they don't see they don't they're not happy about a Shiite revolutionary Iran in the Middle East that it just came out of a huge victory as Iran sees it, ideologically and everything else, against Iraq, who then is engaged with United States and European countries. So these kind of Taliban are not friends of Iran, but they're also kind of fearful of this relationship between Iran and the West, especially if it's getting better and opening up, which is one of the first things Iran tries to do after 9/11, reaching out to the United States. Hey, do you guys want to use our border airports? I mean, these conversations are happening in the background at first, but there is great kind of decrying of these terrorist attacks and all that. But nevertheless, for conversations who would be good for an American history class. When David Frum writes this speech for George Bush, of course, in conversation, at least for political reason, figure out who did this 9/11 and punish them for some reason. But this is also a good opportunity to in reconfiguring Middle East in a way that is beneficial to Iran, United States national interest. And for some odd reasons, which I still can't figure out, then David Frum writes the Axis of Evil speech, which is a speech that kind of construct the policies of the West towards Iran after that. So there's all this enthusiasm within Iran. It's like, and some of it political is like, hey, we want to get rid of Al Qaeda and Taliban and all these people do. Thanks for taking care of Iraq for us. We can pay attention to some other things at this point. But after that, the neoconservatives decide to make Iran a complicit, at least in speech. It's that era was very weird. Along with Iraq, who were also innocent in connections in 9/11, and North Korea as the axis of evil, as the most important enemies of the United States. It was bizarre, considering where these terrorist attacks came from, and considering what United States actual enemies were at this time. But nevertheless, it happened. So Iran's opening itself to this, like, hey, let's join a coalition, do all this cool military stuff together. Maybe we can do some trade. You guys are going to need oil here pretty soon for this war. And this kind of United States, like when Bush makes speech, like it really takes the Iranian officials by surprise that not only we don't want your help, that we are your enemy, and we might actually invade you guys over this, right? And then the attack goes on relentless, then which Iran then has to respond. So what this sudden shift in orientation towards Iran does, going from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, is that gives conservative segment of society in Iran excuse to say that look at these reformists, right? They're always trying to kind of be goody two shoes. They try to reach to the world. They try to open up this country. They try to liberalize the country or Americanize the country, even. Remember that term, Kavzadegi, and they get treated like dogs on the world stage, right? So this kind of this fresh memories of the betrayal of the 1980s is again kind of animated in the early 2000s, that look at the West. They'll never treat us well. They'll never consider us as human. They'll never consider us as friends. They'll never want to engage with us respectfully, all this stuff. They just want to be our enemy, you know? Now they want to overthrow our country, as they're saying on TV for some reason. So that kind of shift that invigorates the conservative fundamentalist parties in Iran is also starts to be a sense that is shared between the population in Iran. You know, because when 9/11 happened, there were kind of vigils vigils, sorry, not vigils, in Iranian streets, people lighting candles, people mourning for the people who died. And so this was, I mean, I don't know how to better say it, but the United States approach to Iran was the biggest fuck you to everything, which cut the legs off of the very argument that legitimatized the Khatami regime, right? That we need to be kind of gentler in the world. We need to be kind of gentler with our people, and we need to move away from this isolationist revolutionary country. Yeah. So then the conservatives are like, oh yeah, how's that? Which they give them a lot of credit. Yeah. So and then there is this. Then there is the baffling kind of acceptance of people like the Mujahideen Khalq, right, who until this point were considered as terrorists as allies to with the United States, you know, which was kind of bizarre. Then there's United States like third attempt at giving support to certain Kurdish factions in Iraq, right? Which has kind of been, you know, Nixon kind of left them to dry. George Bush had left them out to dry, you know, kind of instigate him to start a struggle against Saddam and then let him to die. And now for the third time they're coming, which is kind of weird because while Iran wouldn't mind the Kurdish population fighting against Saddam Hussein, too much Kurdish power would probably lead into an independent Kurdish state, which includes territories from Iran, Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq, which northern Iraq is kind of being called Kurdistan at this point by some people, even though it's not recognized. But nevertheless, there is that. Then the third aspect is that this kind of back and forth relationship with Israel, right? So up until 2001, I mean, you have to kind of look into this. The world is becoming very kind of fed up with Israel and criticizing it. A lot of nations, right, because of assassinations that Israel is partaking, because of what they're doing to Palestinians, this extending of settlements, right, building Israeli settlements within lands that either belong to territories that they took over in 1967 from Palestinians, and some from Arab nations like the Golan Heights or Gaza Strip. Anyway, so after, and this is again the left and right conversation, because after Israeli left-wing politics ends with Al Sharon and then Benjamin Netanyahu, right? This the right wing comes to power. The right wing is never kind of sells that idea of Israel defending its existence through enemies necessary to the world. Um, but that changes also. Like after 2001, Israel is kind of sitting down and makes the argument that look at the people we are fighting, right? We're fighting 9/11 every day, right? This is why we are the way we are, right? And the world suddenly comes, and by the world I mean especially the Western powers like Iran, France, and sorry, America, France, and Britain, and Germany, who are very critical of Israel, to be like, you know what, you're right. And there are many other kind of reasons for this stuff, but nevertheless, that is how it happens. I think there is a lot to consider here. So I'm going to um, leave this. Leave this lecture here, and this is where the slides end. So just kind of leave you with this sudden change in the 2000s, and then we are going to take it from there next Monday. Okay, so I'm going to say my obligatory lines again. Make sure you put in all your works. Make sure you contact me if you have any questions or you need help with anything. And make sure you start working on your exams right now, right? You don't want to leave them for the last weeks or the last 2 weeks, right? Start working on them. You have questions, let me know. I've talked about how what is expected of you many times, and I've kind of made it explicit on your syllabus. But nevertheless, please always ask. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, I'll stay and answer your questions here. You can just type it into the chat going out. But yeah. All right. No questions. Okay, so if something comes to your mind, um, just send me an email and I'll answer it as best as I can. All right, guys. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys later. Take care.